Ranger's Apprentice, Book 1, The Ruins of Gorland, by John Flanagan. Chapter 19. They rode slowly through the failing light, leaning sideways in their saddles to follow the trail left by the boar. They had no trouble tracking him. The huge body had left a deep trench in the thick snow. Even without the snow, Will thought it would have been easy. The boar was obviously in a very bad temper. He had slashed the surrounding trees and shrubs with his tusks as it went, leaving a clear-cut path of destruction through the forest. "Halt," he said tentatively, when they had gone a kilometer or so into the dense trees. Said Halt a little absently. "Why bother the Baron? Couldn't we simply kill the boar with our bows?" Halt shook his head. "It's a big one, Will. You can see the size of the trail he's left. We could take half a dozen arrows to kill him, and even then he'd take time to die. For the brute like this, it's better to make sure." "How do we do that?" Holt looked up for a second. "I suppose you've never seen a boar hunt?" Will shook his head. Holt reined in for a few seconds to explain, and Will brought Tuka to a stop beside him. "Well, first, we'll need dogs. That's another reason why we can't simply finish him off with our bows. When we find him, he'll have most likely gone to ground in a thicket or in the dense bushes where we can't get at him. The dogs will drive him out, and we'll have a ring of men around the lair with boar spears." "And they throw them at him?" Will asked. Holt shook his head. "Not if they have any brains. The boar spear is more than 2 meters long with a double-sided blade and a crosspiece set behind the blade. The idea is to make the boar charge the spearman. Then he sets the butt of the spear in the ground and lets the boar run onto it. The crosspiece stops the boar running right down the shaft and getting the spearman." Will looked doubtful. "That sounds dangerous." The ranger nodded. "It is, but men like the Baron and Sir Rodney and the other knights love it. They wouldn't miss the chance of a boar hunt for worlds." "What about you? Will you have a boar spear?" Holt shook his head. "I'll be sitting right here on andHalt," he said, "and you'll be on Took in case the boar breaks through the ring of men around him, or in case he's just wounded and gets away." "What do we do if that happens?" Will asked. "We run him down before he can go to ground again, and then we kill him with our bows." The following day was Saturday, and after breakfast the battle school students were free to spend the day as they pleased. In Horace's case, this usually meant trying to stay out of sight whenever Alderbrin and Jerome came looking for him. But lately they'd realized he was avoiding them and had taken to waiting for him outside the mess hall. As he came out onto the parade ground this morning, he saw them waiting, smiling at him. He hesitated. It was too late to turn back. With a sinking heart, he continued on to watch them. "Horace!" He was startled by a voice coming from right behind him. He turned and saw Sir Rodney watching him, a curious look in his eyes as he glanced at the 3 second-year cadets waiting in the yard. Horace wondered if the battlemaster knew about the treatment he was getting. He assumed he did. Horace guessed it was part of the toughening process of battle school. "Sir," he replied, wondering what he'd done wrong. Rodney's features softened and he smiled at the young man. He seemed extraordinarily pleased about something. "Relax, Horace. It's Saturday after all. Ever been on a boar hunt?" No, sir." In spite of Sir Rodney's invitation to relax, he remained stiffly at attention. "Time you did, then. Draw a boar spear and hunting knife from the armory. Have Ulf assign you a horse and report back here in 20 minutes. "Yes, sir," Horace replied. Sir Rodney rubbed his hands together with evident pleasure. "Seems Holt and his apprentice have scared up us a wild boar. Time we all had a bit of fun." He grinned encouragingly at the apprentice, then strode away eagerly to get his own equipment ready. When Horace turned back to the yard, he noticed that Alderbrin and Jerome were nowhere to be seen. He might have thought more about why the 3 bullets would disappear when Sir Rodney was around, but he had too much on his mind, wondering what he'd be expected to do in a boar hunt. It was mid-morning by the time Holt led the hunting party to the boar's lair. The huge animal had gone to ground in a dense clump of undergrowth deep inside the forest. Holt and Will had found the hiding place just before dark the previous evening. Now as they approached, Halt made a signal, and the Baron and his hunters dismounted, leaving their horses in the care of one of the stable hands who had accompanied them. They covered the last few hundred meters on foot. Halt and Will were the only two who remained on horseback. There were 15 hunters in all, each one armed with a boar spear of the type Halt had described. They spread out in a wide circle as they came closer to the boar's lair. Will was a little surprised to recognize Horace in the hunting group. He was the only apprentice warrior in the party. All the others were knights. With 100 meters to go, Halt held up his hand, signaling the hunters to stop. He urged Abelard into a gentle trot and crossed to where Will sat nervously astride and took. The little horse was moving restlessly as he scented the presence of the boar. "Remember," the ranger said quietly to Will, "if you have to shoot, aim for a spot just behind the left shoulder. A clean shot to the heart will be your only chance to stop him if he's charging." Will nodded, licking his dry lips nervously. He reached forward and comforted Took with a quick pat on the neck. The little horse tossed his head in response to his master's touch. "And stay close to the Baron," Halt reminded him, before moving to resume his position in the opposite side of the circle of hunters. Halt was in position of most danger, accompanying the hunters who were least experienced, and therefore most likely to make a mistake. If the boar broke through the ring on his side, he would be responsible for chasing it down and killing it. He had assigned Will to stay with the Baron and the more experienced of the hunters, where there were less likely to be trouble. This placed him close to Horace as well. So Rodney had positioned the apprentice between himself and the Baron. After all, this was the boy's first hunt. The battlemaster didn't want to take any undue risks. Horace was there to watch and learn. If the boar charged in a direction, was to let the Baron and Sir Rodney take care of it. Horace glanced up once, making eye contact with Will. There was no anonymity in the look. In fact, he gave the range apprentice a strained half-smile. Will realized, watching Horace lick his lips over and over again, that the boy was every bit as nervous as he was himself. Halt signaled again, and the circle began closing in with a thicket. As the circle became smaller, Will lost sight of his teacher and the other men on the far side of the boar's lair. He knew from Took's continued nervousness that the boar must be inside the bushes still. But Took was well trained and continued to move in as his rider urged him gently forward. A deep roaring sound came from inside the thicket, and Will's hair stood on end. He never heard the cry of an angry wild boar before. The noise was halfway between a grunt and a scream, and for a moment the hunters hesitated. "He's in there all right," called the Baron, grinning at Will with excitement. "Let's hope he comes out on our side, eh, boys?" Will wasn't at all sure that he wanted the boar to come charging out on the side of the thicket. He thought that he'd like it very well if it went the other way. But the Baron and Sir Rodney were both grinning like schoolboys as they readied their boar spears. They were enjoying this just as Halt said they would. Quickly, Will unslung his bow from across his shoulder and fitted an arrow to the string. He fingered the tip for a moment, making sure it was still razor sharp. His throat was dry. He wasn't sure that he would be able to talk if anyone spoke to him. The dogs plunged against the restraining leashes, setting the echoes awake in the forest with their excited baying. It was their noise that aroused the boar. Now as they continued to give voice, Will could hear the huge animal slashing and cutting at the trees and shrubs in its lair with its long tusks. The Baron turned to Bert, his dog handler, and made a hand signal for the hounds to be released. The big, powerful animals were gone almost instantly, flashing across the cleared space to the thicket and disappearing inside. They were savage, heavily built beasts, bred specifically for the purpose of hunting boar. The noise from the thicket were indescribable. The furious baying of the dogs were joined by the blood-chilling screams of the angry boar. There was a crashing and snapping of bushes and young saplings. The very thicket seemed to shake. Then suddenly, the boar was in the clear. He came out halfway around the circle between points where Will and Halt were stationed. With an infuriated scream, he threw off one of the dogs that still clung to him, paused a moment, then charged at the hunters with blinding speed. The young knight directly in front of the boar charge didn't hesitate. He dropped to one knee, bracing the butt end of the spear in the ground, and presented the gleaming point to a charging animal. The boar had no chance to turn. His own rush carried him onto the spearhead. He plunged upward, screaming in pain and fury, trying to dislodge the killing piece of steel. But the young knight held grimly to the spear, holding it firmly against the ground and giving the enraged animal no chance to forward free. Will watched with wide-eyed alarm as the stout ash shaft of the spear bent like a bow under the weight of the boar's rush. Then the carefully sharpened tip penetrated into the animal's heart, and it was all over. With one last screaming roar, the huge boar toppled sideways and lay dead. The matted body was almost as large as the horse's, and every inch was solid muscle. The tusk was harmless now in death, curved back over his furious snout. They were stained with the earth that he had ripped up in his fury and with the blood of at least one of the dogs. Will looked at the massive body and shuddered. If this was a wild boar, he thought, he wasn't in any hurry to see another one. Chapter 20. The other hunters crowded around the young knight, who had made the kill, congratulating him and patting his back. andHalt started across towards him, but paused beside Took, looking up to Will as he spoke. "You won't see another one that size in a long time, Will," he said gruffly. "Pity he didn't come our way. I would have liked a trophy like that for myself." He continued on his way towards Sir Rodney, who was already with the group of warriors around the dead boar. Consequently, Will found himself for the first time in some weeks face to face with Horace. There was an awkward pause, with neither boy willing to make the first move. Horace, excited by the events of the morning, his heart still pounding with the thrill of fear he'd felt when the boar first appeared, wanted to share the moment with Will. In the light of what they'd just seen, the childish squabble seemed unimportant, and now he felt badly about his behavior on that day 6 weeks ago. But he couldn't find the words to express his feelings, and he saw no encouragement to do so in Will's set features. So with a slight shrug, he started to step past Tuck to go and congratulate the young hunter. As he did so, the pony stiffened and pricked his ears, giving a warning neigh. Will looked back at the thicket, and his blood seemed to freeze in his veins. There, standing just outside the shelter of the bushes, was another boar, even larger than the one which now lay dead in the snow. "Look out!" he cried as the huge beast slashed at the earth with his tusk. It was a bad situation. The line of hunters had broken up, most of them having moved over to marvel at the size of the dead boar and to praise its killer. Only Will and Horace remained in the path of the second boar. Mainly Will realized, because Horace had hesitated for those few vital seconds. Horace spun around at Will's shout. He looked at Will, then swung to look at the new danger. The boar lowered its head toward the ground again and charged. It all happened with terrifying speed. One moment the huge animal was ripping the ground with its tusks. The next, it was hurtling towards them. Placing himself between Will and the boar, Horace turned without hesitation to face it, setting his spear Sir Rodney and the Baron had showed him. But as he did so, his foot slipped on an icy patch in the snow, and he sprawled helplessly onto the side, the long spear falling from his grasp. There was not a second to lose. Horace lay helplessly before the murderous tusks. Will kicked his feet clear of the stirrups and dropped to the ground, sighing and drawing back the bowstring even as he did so. He knew his small bow would have no chance of stopping the boar's mettled rush. All he could do was hope that to distract the maddened animal, to turn it away from the helpless boy on the ground. He fired and instantly ran to one side away from the fallen apprentice. He yelled at the top of his lungs and fired again. The arrow struck out of the boar's thick hide like needles in a pin and cushion. They did no serious harm, but the pain of them burned through the animal like a hot knife. Its red, angry eyes fastened on the small, capering figure to one side, and furiously it swung after Will. There was no time to fire again. Horace was safe for the moment. Now, Will himself was in danger. He sprinted for the shelter of a tree and dug behind it, just in time. The boar's enraged charge carried it straight onto the trunk of the tree. Its huge body crashed against the trunk, shaking it to its roots, sending showers of snow cascading out of its upper branches. Amazingly, the boar seemed unaffected by the crash. It backed up a few paces and charged at Will again. The boy darted around the tree trunk again, narrowly avoiding the slashing tusks as the boar thundered by. Screaming in fury, the huge animal spun in its tracks, skidding in the snow, and came at him again. This time it came more slowly, giving Will no chance to dart to one side at the last moment. The boar came at a trot, fury in its red eyes, tusks slashing from side to side, its hot breath steaming in the freezing winter air. Behind him, Will could hear the shots of the hunters, but he knew they'd arrived too late to help him. He knocked another arrow, knowing that he had no chance of fighting a vital spot as the pig came at him head on. Then there was a thud of a muffled hoofs in the snow, and a small shaggy shape was driving toward the furious monster. "No, Took!" Will screamed in agony of fear for his horse. But the pony charged at the huge boar, spinning in his track and lashing out with his rear hoofs as he came within range. Took's rear hoofs caught the pig in the rib, and with all the force of the pony's upper legs behind it, sent the boar rolling sideways in the snow. The boar was up in an instant, even more furious than before. The pony had caught him off balance, but the kick had done no serious damage. Now the boar slashed and cut at Took as the little pony neighed in fear and danced sideways out of the reach of those razor-sharp tusks. "Took, get clear!" Will screamed again. His heart was in his throat. If those tusks caught the vulnerable tendons in the horse's lower legs, Took would be crippled for life. He couldn't stand by and watch his horse put himself in such peril for his master. He drew and fired again, and dragging the long ranger knives from his belt, charged across the snow at a huge, furious beast. The third arrow struck the pig in the side. Again he had missed a vulnerable spot, and only wounded the monster. He yelled at it as he ran, screaming for Took to get clear. The boar saw him coming, recognizing the small figure that he had first driven into such a fury. Its red, hate-filled eyes fastened upon him, and its head lowered for a final killing charge. Will saw the muscles bunch in the massive hindquarters. He was too far from cover to run. He'd had to face the charge here in the open. He dropped to one knee and helplessly held out the keen-bladed ranger knife in front of him as the boar charged. Dimly he heard Horace cry as the apprentice warrior charged forward to help him, his spear at the ready. Then a deep, whistling hiss cut across the sound of the boar's hooves, followed by a solid meaty smack. The boar reared up in mid-stride, twisting in sudden agony, and fell dead as a stone in the snow. Halt's heavy-shafted long arrow was almost buried in its side, driven there by the full power of the ranger's mighty longbow. It struck the charging monster right behind the left shoulder, driving the head of the arrow through the pig's massive heart. A perfect shot. Halt reined in Appellite in the shower of snow and hurled himself to the ground, throwing his arms around the shaking boy. Will, overcome with relief, burrowed his face in through the rough cloth of the ranger's cloak. He didn't want anyone to see the tears of relief that were streaming down his face. Gently, Halt took the knife from Will's hand. "What on earth were you hoping to do with this?" he asked. Will simply shook his head. He couldn't speak. He felt Took's soft muzzle butting gently against him and looked up into the big, intelligent eyes. Then it was all noise and confusion as the hunters gathered around, marveling at the size of the second boar and slapping Will on the back for his courage. He stood among them, a small figure, ashamed still of the tears that slid down his cheeks, no matter how hard he tried to stop them. He felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to find he was looking into Horace's eyes, and the apprentice warrior was shaking his head slowly in admiration and disbelief. "You saved my life," he said. "That was the bravest thing I've ever seen." Will tried to shrug the other boy's fangs aside, but Horace pressed on. He remembered all the times in the past when he'd teased Will, when he'd bullied him. Now, acting instinctively, the smaller boy had saved him from those murderous slashing tusks. It said something for Horace's growing up maturity that he had forgotten his own instinctive reaction when he had placed himself between the charging boar and the apprentice ranger. "But why, Will? After all, He couldn't bring himself to finish the statement, but Will somehow knew what was on his mind. "Horace, we may have fought in the past," he said, "but I don't hate you. I never hated you." Horace nodded once, a look of understanding coming over his face. Then he seemed to come to a decision. "I owe you my life, Will," he said in a determined voice. "I'll never forget that debt. If you ever need a friend, if ever you need help, you can call on me." The two boys faced each other for a moment, then Horace thrust out his hand, and Will shook it. The circle of knights around them was silent, witnessing, but not wanting to interrupt. This was an important moment for the two boys. Then Baron andHalt stepped forward and put his arms around them both. "Well said, both of you," he said heartily, and the knights aroused their assent. The Baron grinned delightedly. It had been a perfect morning all told. A bit of excitement, 2 huge boars killed, and now 2 of his wards forging the sort of special bond that only came from sheer danger. "We got 2 fine young men here," he said to the group at large, and again there was a hearty chorus of assent. "Halt, Rodney, you can both be proud of your apprentices." "Indeed we are, my lord," said Rodney. He nodded approvingly at Horace. He'd seen the way the boy had turned without hesitation to face the charge, and he approved of Horace's open offer of friendship to Will. He remembered all too well seeing them fighting on Harvest Day. It seemed such childish squabbles were behind them now, and he felt a deep satisfaction that he had chosen Horace for battle school. Halt for his part said nothing, but when Will turned to look at his mentor, the grizzled ranger made his eyes and simply nodded. And that, Will knew, was the equivalent of 3 hearty cheers from Halt. Chapter 21. In the days following the boar hunt, Will noticed a change in the way he was treated. There was a certain deference, even respect in the way people spoke to him and looked at him as he passed. It was most noticeable among the people of the village. Being simple folk with rather limited boundaries to their day-to-day life, they tended to glamorize and exaggerate any event that was in the way out of the ordinary. By the end of the first week, the events of the hunt had been so blown out of proportion that they had Will single-handedly killing both boars as they charged out of the thicket. A couple of days after that, to hear the story related, you could almost believe that he had accomplished the feat with one arrow firing it clean through the first boar into the heart of the second. "I really didn't do too much at all," he said to Halt one evening, as they sat by the fire in the warm little cottage they shared on the edge of the forest. "I mean, it's not as if I thought it through and decided to do it. It just sort of happened, and after all, you killed the boar, not me." Halt merely nodded, staring fixatedly at the leaping yellow flames in the grate. "People will think what they want to," he said quietly. "Never take too much notice of it." Nevertheless, Will was troubled by the adulation. He felt people were making an altogether too big thing out of it all. He would have enjoyed the respect if it had been based on what had actually happened. In his heart, he felt he had done something worthwhile, and perhaps even honorable. But he was being lionized for a total fictional account of events and being an essentially honest person. He couldn't really take any pride in that. He also felt a little embarrassed, because he was one of the few people who had noticed Horace's original instinctively courageous action, placing himself between the charging boar and Will and took. Will had mentioned this last fact to Halt. He felt that perhaps the ranger might have an opportunity to appraise Sir Rodney of Horace's unselfish action. But his teacher had merely nodded and said briefly, "Sir Rodney knows. He doesn't miss much. He's got a little more up top than the average bash and whacker." And with that, Will had to be content. Around the castle with the knights from the battle school and the various craftmasters and apprentices, the attitudes were different there. Will enjoyed a simple acceptance and the recognition of the fact that he had done well. He noticed that the people tended to know his name now, so that they greeted him as well as Halt when the 2 of them had business in the castle grounds. The Baron himself was friendlier than ever. It was a source of pride to him to see one of his castle wards acquit himself well. The one person Will would have liked to discuss it all with was Horace himself. But as their paths seldom crossed, the opportunity hadn't arisen. He wanted to make sure that the warrior apprentice knew that Will set no store by the ridiculous stories that had swept in the village, and he hoped that his former wardmate knew he had done nothing to spread the rumors. In the meantime, Will's lessons and training proceeded at an accelerated pace. In a month's time, Halt had told him they would be leaving for the gathering, an annual event in the ranger's calendar. This was the time when all 50 rangers came together to exchange news, to discuss any problems that might have arisen throughout the kingdom, and to make plans. Of greater importance to Will was also the time when apprentices were assessed to see if they were fit to progress to the next year of their training. It was bad luck for Will that he had been in training for only 7 months. If he didn't pass the assessment at this year's gathering, he would have to wait another year until the next opportunity arose. As a result, he practiced and practiced from dawn to dusk each day. The idea of a Saturday holiday was long forgotten luxury to him. He fired arrow after arrow into targets of different sizes in different conditions, from standing, kneeling, sitting, even fired from hidden positions in trees. And he practiced with his knives, standing to throw, kneeling, sitting, diving to the left, diving to the right. He practiced throwing the large of the 2 knives so that it struck its target's hilt first. After all, as Hall said, Sometimes you only needed to stun the person you were throwing at, so it was a good idea to know how to do it. He practiced his stealth skills, learning to stay stock still even when he was sure that he'd been discovered, and learning that all too often people simply didn't notice him until he actually did move and gave the game away. He learned the trick that searchers would use, letting the gaze pass over a spot and then flicking back to it instantly to catch any slight movement. He learned about sweepers, the real scouts who would follow silently behind a party on the move, to catch out anyone who might have remained unseen then broken cover when the party had gone past. He retook strengthening the bond and affection that had taken root so quickly between the two of them. He learned to use the little horse's extra senses of smell and hearing to give him a warning of any danger. He had learned the signals that the horse was trained to send to its rider. It was a little wonder that at the end of the day Will had no inclination to walk up the winding path that led to Castle Redmond and find Horace, so that he could discuss things with him. He accepted that sooner or later the chance would come. In the meantime, he could only hope that Horace was being given credit for his actions by Sir Rodney and the other members of Battle School. Unfortunately for Horace, it seemed that nothing could be further from the truth. Sir Rodney was puzzled by the muscular young apprentice. He seemed to have all the qualities that the Battle School was looking for. He was brave, he followed orders immediately, and he was still showing extraordinary skill in his weapons training. But his classwork was below standard. Assignments were handed in late or sloppily finished. He seemed to have trouble paying attention to his instructors, as if he were distracted all the time. On top of that, it was suspected that he had a predilection for fighting. None of the staff had ever witnessed him fighting, but he was often seen to be sporting bruises and minor contusions, and he seemed to have made no close friends among his classmates. On the contrary, they took pains to steer clear of him. It all served to create a picture of an argumentative, antisocial, lazy recruit who had a certain amount of skill at arms. All things considered, and with a great deal of reluctance, the battlemaster was beginning to feel he would have to expel Horace from Battle School. All the evidence seemed to point in that direction. Yet his instinct told him he was wrong, that there was some other factor he wasn't aware of. In point of fact, that there were 3 other factors, Alda, Bryn, and Jerome, and even as the battlemaster was considering the future of his newest recruit, they had Horace surrounded once more. It seemed that each time Horace managed to find a place where he could escape their attentions, the 3 older students tracked him down. Of course, this wasn't difficult for them, as they had a network of spies and informants among the younger boys who were afraid of them, both in and outside of Battle School. This time they had cornered Horace behind the armory in a quiet spot that he had discovered a few days before. He was hemmed in against the stone wall of the armory building, the 3 bullies standing in a half circle before him. Each of them carried a thick cane, and Alda had a piece of heavy hacking folded over one arm. "We've been looking for you, baby," said Alda. Horace said nothing. His eyes shifted from one to the other as he wondered which of them would be the first to make a move. "Baby made a fool of us. Made a fool of the entire Battle School," that was Jerome. Horace frowned, puzzled by the words. He had no idea what they were talking about. Alda's next statement made it clear. "Baby had to be rescued from the big bad boar," he said, "by a little creeping apprentice sneaker," Bryn added, the sneer heavy in his tone. "And that makes us all look bad." Jerome shoved him against the shoulder as he spoke, pushing him back against the rough stone of the wall. His face was red and angry, and Horace knew he was building himself up for something. Horace's hands bunched into fist at his side. Jerome saw the action. "Don't threaten me, baby. Time you learned a lesson." He stepped forward threateningly. Horace turned to face him, and in the same instant knew he had made a mistake. Jerome's move was a feint. A real attack came from Alda, who whipped a heavy hessian sack over Horace's head before he could resist, pulling a drawcord tight that he was constrained from the waist up, blinded and helpless. He felt several loops of the drawcord falling over his shoulder to fasten it. Then the blows began. He staggered blindly, helpless to defend himself as the 3 boys rained blows down on him from the heavy canes that they had been carrying. He blundered into the wall and felt unable to break his fall on his unprotected head, his arms and legs, as the 3 boys continued their mindless litany of hate. "Call for the sneaker to save you now, baby. This is for making us all look like a fool. Learn to respect for your battle school, baby. On and on it went as he writhed on the ground, trying in vain to escape the blows. It was the worst beating that they ever given him, and they continued until gradually, mercifully, he felt still semi-conscious. Each hit him a few more times, then Alder dragged the sack clear. Horace drew in one giant shuddering breath of fresh air. He ached and hurt viciously in every part of his body. From a long distance away, he heard Bryn's voice. "Now let's teach the sneaker the same lesson." The others laughed, and he heard them moving away. He groaned softly, longing for the release of unconsciousness, wanting to let himself sink into the dark, welcoming arms so that the pain would go away, at least for a while. Then the full import of Bryn's words struck him. They were going to give the same treatment to Will, for the ridiculous reason that they felt his action in saving Horace had somehow belittled them in their battle school. With a gigantic effort, he pushed the welcoming folds of darkness back and struggled to his feet, moaning with the pain, chest heaving, head spinning as he supported himself against the wall. He remembered his promise to Will. "If you ever need a friend, you can call on me." It was time to make good of that promise.